Hello, so I'm Caroline and I am a physiotherapist, but today I am here to talk to you about my experience from the other side of things, so being a patient. Okay, so in 2019 I was working as a physio on a trauma ward. I was very active, so I did triathlons, half marathons. I spent most of my spare time doing something outdoors and active. In the February of that year, whilst I was out cycling with family, we got hit head-on by an out-of-control drunk driver. So I took a direct impact from the car on the right-hand side of my body at an estimated 60 to 70 miles per hour. I've got no memory of this or of about 2 days beforehand. Luckily for me, my sister was with me, who happens to be an anaesthetist, and there was an ambulance on the scene within minutes. So I was resuscitated at the scene and then taken to hospital in Cardiff. So there I was put on a ventilator, I was put in a coma and taken to intensive care. So in the space of 48 hours, I'd gone from being a physio working to a patient on intensive care in the same hospital. So I had a lot of injuries. I had a head injury, I'd broken my neck at C6-7, I broke my left hand, I had internal bleeding in my abdomen and in my pelvis. I'd broken my pelvis in lots of places. I had a fracture that went through my sacrum. I had broken my right leg in lots of places, some of the fractures you can see up there. I also went on to develop compartment syndrome in my right thigh, as I had a big penetrating wound going through my right thigh, and then that led to kidney damage. So the next day, I was on intensive care, and I was continuing to deteriorate. So I was still bleeding internally. But they were able to locate this bleed and embolize an artery in my pelvis, which stopped the bleed, and that ultimately saved my life. So the next 10 days, I went on to have a lot more surgeries. So I had my neck fused, I had rods put across my pelvis. And I had a lot of plates and screws put into that right leg. I also had a fasciotomy of my right thigh and a decompression of my right thigh. And I had various skin and muscle grafts as well. So luckily for me, I'm still intubated and sedated on intensive care at this point, so I'm unaware that any of this is going on. When I do first wake up on intensive care, everything is really blurry. So I was told I was really confused. I know that I was hallucinating, and it's not really until about 10 days after that I can start to put stuff in a bit of a timeline. And even then, I was quite accepting of being there, and I'm not really sure if this is because I'd worked in that environment before, but I think really I just hadn't processed at all what happened, and definitely not the severity of what happened. So I was in a strange, dreamlike sort of state. So I had been doing quite well on intensive care, and the plan was to transfer me up to the ward. Then I developed pulmonary edema. So I can remember that my breathing started to get worse and worse. I had chest pain, and it got to the point where it felt like I was drowning. So it felt like I was trying to breathe underwater. So as I was breathing in, it felt like I was breathing in water, and as I was breathing out, it felt like I was breathing against the resistance of water. So this was terrifying. It went on for several hours until they could put me on some machines to support my kidneys, but for me, it felt like a lot longer than this. So the next day, I was feeling really vulnerable, I was exhausted, quite traumatized by what had just happened, and a new face came round to my bedside. They didn't introduce themselves, and they just said, "Your kidneys are really badly damaged, we'll try dialysis, and then we'll have to see." Okay? And then they moved on to the next bed. So that left me with loads of unanswered questions, loads of worries about what that actually meant. And it made me feel like I was just a job on that person's list. They ticked off and then they'd moved on to their next job. So I was moved up to the trauma ward, and this was strange because just over a month before, I'd been working on that ward as a physio, and now I was lying in a bed as a patient, unable to do anything for myself. I was exhausted when I first got onto that ward, so it wasn't really until a few weeks later, when I was able to do a bit more rehab, that me and my physio colleagues realised that I couldn't really move my right leg at all. So only my quads and my adductors were working in my right leg. So I was sent for more scans and more tests, and these showed that I had severely damaged my sciatic nerve and both of my gluteal nerves on that right side. The damage was at nerve root level, and some of those nerves had been severed, so that meant that some of this damage was going to be permanent. So as a physio, I knew what this meant straight away. I knew what muscles those nerves innervated, what function those muscles did, and what that potentially looked like in terms of quality of life. So I'd gone from being really active and working as a physio to now facing the fact that I may never walk again unaided. So at this point, I was absolutely devastated. So next, I really wanted rehab, as I knew that this was going to give me the best possible chance of any recovery. Because of where I worked and who I knew, I was able to go to the Specialist Spinal Injury Centre, where I had 12 weeks of rehab as an outpatient. So that gave me access to physio, to OTs, to a psychologist, to an orthotist, and there was also a rehab consultant who was probably the first person who looked at me as a whole person rather than all of my injuries individually. So I improved a lot over those 12 weeks, but that's not standard for someone who had my sort of injuries, so you wouldn't normally get that level of rehab. So going home, I found this a really big transition. So although I really wanted to be there, you're also back in your own environment, so all the things that you used to be able to do that you can't do anymore become a lot more obvious. So everything becomes a lot more real, and the rest of the world is still carrying on around you. When I was first at home, I was still under the care of that spinal injury centre, so they were able to support me through some of this, but after 12 weeks, that ended, and I was under the care of my GP. Now, my GP, they weren't an expert in polytrauma, they didn't really have a huge understanding of my situation, and their main focus seemed to be, okay, let's get you back to work. So at this stage, work was a really long way off for me. So I was still using crutches, I was still taking morphine, I couldn't concentrate, and I was really struggling with fatigue. So at this point, we didn't know if I was going to be able to work as a physio again. So I started to feel quite alone and unsupported. So for me, that feeling didn't last that long because of the nature of how my injuries had happened. I was able to make a personal injury claim against the car driver's insurance. So that gave me access to funding for more physio, for psychology, for orthotics. And with all of this, then I continued to improve. So after a year, I was walking using just a stick. By 15 months, I'd stopped using that stick. And at 18 months, I'd returned to work in a slightly different role. So as you can see, things don't end when you leave hospital. I've got lots of muscles in my right leg that don't work. I can't feel most of my right leg. I have nerve pain, which affects my sleep. I have to wear orthotics permanently to walk. And I've had to have a lot more surgeries than the ones that I've mentioned there. But despite this, because of all the rehab that I have had, I am able to still do quite a lot. So I can still walk about 10 kilometres on flat ground wearing just my orthotic. I can still hill and coastal walk. I just have to use poles when I'm doing this. I can still swim, and I'm back working clinically again as a physio. So as I said, I have received so much life-saving treatment and care from some amazing people, but I've also had a lot of access to rehab, and that's not standard for people with my sort of injuries. So you normally get a lot of care and a lot of treatment during that hospital environment, but then when you're out in the community and you're back at home, that drops off. So access to rehab and support after trauma really does need to be a lot better. As a student, you might not feel that you can necessarily influence pathways that much at the moment, but I think that you can always be a voice for promoting rehab. So I was given a really poor prognosis, and what I've achieved through rehab is so much more than anyone ever predicted. So rehab really does work. There were times during my recovery when I would say that I felt quite alone, and I can remember searching online for people who had similar injuries to myself. And at the time, I couldn't find anyone. More recently, I have found a charity called Day One Trauma, and I now volunteer for their peer support service. So I have phone calls with people who've recently been through a trauma, and being able to speak to someone who knows what it's like, who knows how you're feeling, it's really, really powerful. So I also get something out of this, as I feel like I'm giving something back, and it reminds me that I'm not alone as well. So I think as physios, we need to be aware of other sectors that are out there, like the charity sector, that we can potentially signpost people through to that can offer things that often the NHS or ourselves can't provide. So communication, and some of this will link in with what we heard this morning, and I think this is probably my most important message today. It's what I learnt the most about through all of this. I know how important and impactful communication can be, and it's something that we can always, everyone can always improve on. So remember that patients are people. It could be you in that bed. So I spoke about the doctor on intensive care and how they made me feel like I was just a job on their list. And that's dehumanising. It gave me a lot of additional anxiety about my kidney damage that was probably quite unnecessary. I think when you are qualified and you're working, patients become your day-to-day. They become your day in, day out. But just remember, for that person in that bed, that's not their normal. They've never been in that situation before, and they often haven't chosen to be in that situation. So what you say and how you say it really does have an impact. Major trauma or any life-changing event is a really emotional situation. So people are going to be upset. They're going to be struggling to process what's happened to them. And that can be a really challenging environment to work in. I often found that people didn't know what to say to me. And sometimes clinicians reverted to using cliches. So something that I heard more than once was, you can achieve anything that you want to achieve. And when you're lying in a bed and you are in huge amounts of pain, you've got a leg that doesn't move and you don't know if that's ever going to change, that statement's not true, and it's really difficult to hear. And looking back, I know that those people were just trying to be positive and uplifting, but that's not always how it comes across. So think about what you're saying, and actually in those situations, it's not usually about talking. Stopping and listening is normally what you need to do. It's normally the most important thing to do. So there are loads of courses out there that you can do that will help improve your communication. But I think when you've got spare time on clinical placements, just go and talk to patients, go and listen to their stories, really listen to them, try and understand things from their perspective. And I believe that it's this ability to listen that will make you a better physio. So on that note, thank you for listening to my story today, and I hope that you can take something positive away from it.